Jackson Riggs had one goal after 20 years of field work with the Army Corps of Engineers: settle down, build the backyard haven he'd always dreamed of, and never touch another sandbag in his life. So when he bought the Gray Brick Ranch, on Echo Ridge Drive, tucked neatly on the lower slope of Ravenwood Hills, it felt like he'd finally outrun the noise of life. What he didn't count on was running into Karen Dilly. She introduced herself on the very first morning with a knock that felt like it came from a battering ram, clipboard in one hand, sunglasses that refused to blink, in a tone too polite to be genuine. Karen welcomed Jackson to the neighborhood with a 2-page list of landscaping guidelines and a firm reminder that the HOA takes water flow very seriously. Jackson smiled, thanked her, and went back to measuring out his yard for native plants and a small retaining wall. He figured she'd get bored once she saw he wasn't some college kid blasting music in the garage. She didn't. A week later, a formal notice arrived. His desert shrubs were visually non-conforming. 2 days after that, a second notice appeared, citing his gravel border for unauthorized runoff redirection. He laughed the first time. He didn't laugh the third dot. It rained on a Thursday, not a light sprinkle, the kind of downpour that turns sidewalks into creeks. Jackson made a habit of watching how water traveled. It was second nature to him. Where it pooled, where it rolled, how it obeyed invisible lines drawn by concrete and dirt. That night, he noticed something off. His backyard, always level and dry, started pooling halfway to the patio. He walked out with a flashlight and boots. The upper slope, the part bordering Karen's property, was wetter than it should have been. A steady stream trickled down from the row of freshly trimmed shrubs between their fences. He followed it to the corner, crouched low, and saw it. A thin PVC pipe poking through the hedge, angled directly into his yard. Still dripping. Jackson stood there, quiet. He didn't curse. Didn't storm over. He just went inside and pulled out his old waterproof field log. Then he sketched everything. Direction, flow rate, elevation, slope gradient. Not because he wanted revenge, because habits die hard. And this one had just reawakened. The next day, he knocked on Karen's door. She smiled as if nothing had happened. "Morning, Mr. Riggs," she chirped, standing between him and the smell of chlorine wafting from her overwatered lawn. "I think your irrigation might be spilling into my yard." "Oh, haven't noticed." "Anything strange?" He didn't push it, just nodded, thanked her, and left. But that night, he did more than sketch. He started laying out shallow drainage contours. Nothing obvious, nothing that would violate any lines. Just a few inches of slope difference to read the ground like a map. By Sunday morning, Karen had filed a second violation, this time for unauthorized excavation. Jackson hadn't even finished breakfast when the letter arrived. But the real surprise came 10 minutes later, when he stepped outside. The entire backyard was underwater. It wasn't a storm, wasn't rain. This was fresh hose water, still warm to the touch. He traced it to the same pipe, now with a second one running beside it. Jackson stood in silence. He looked up at Karen's window. Her blinds shifted slightly, as if someone had just let go. He didn't yell. He walked inside, dried off, and went to the shed. From the back corner, he pulled out a weathered canvas duffel bag. Inside were two things he hadn't touched in years: a portable slope meter and a set of floodgate mini panels he'd once designed during a field test in Arizona. He set them on the workbench, turned on the overhead light, and finally spoke, out loud to no one in particular. "All right, let's dance." The narrator cuts in, just as the camera pans over Jackson, marking out his yard like a battlefield. If you've ever had a neighbor like this, hit that button and stick around, because Jackson's about to show exactly why you don't send water downhill unless you're ready for what it brings back. By Monday morning, the sun returned and the water in Jackson Riggs' yard began to recede, but the damage was already done. His young agave plants leaned sideways in muddy pools. The mulch had been swept into piles like damp seaweed, and the gravel border he'd carefully laid had turned into a gray soup. Jackson didn't call anyone. He didn't march over to Karen's porch. He went into town and came back with a set of motion lights, 2 solar trail cameras, and a long coil of drippling tubing that didn't match anything in his yard. The rest of the day, he worked quietly, dug a new trench line near the back fence, lined it with burlap, and topped it with wood chips to make it look like decorative mulch. From a distance, it looked like landscaping. Up close, it was something else entirely. That evening, Jackson sat on his back porch with a tall glass of iced tea and waited at 2:47 a.m. The motion lights flicked on. A shadow moved along the side of the fence. Thin frame, baseball cap, garden gloves. A man in his 60s, one of those neighbors who always seemed to walk the dog at night, even though nobody ever saw the dog. Jackson didn't move, just watched from the shadows as the man crouched at the fence, tugged something from under Karen's side, and connected it to the pipe feeding into Jackson's slope. The man slipped away, silent as ever. Jackson smiled, not wide, just enough to say, "Now we're getting somewhere." The next morning, Jackson reviewed the footage. The man was easy to identify. Doug Keener, longtime HOA board member, backyard neighbor. Doug had a reputation for landscaping help and private patrols. He also had a key to the HOA's irrigation utility box. That detail wasn't written anywhere, but everyone knew. Jackson took a copy of the footage, locked it in a file, and made 3 more copies, one for himself, one for city code enforcement, and one for the right moment. Then he went to work. The next 3 days, Jackson made small changes to his yard. He didn't call it construction, he didn't submit any requests, he called it maintenance. But behind the scenes, he was quietly building a passive drainage network that could reroute excess water, with pressure valves that could swing open based on slope triggers. It was a design he'd used once overseas. It didn't require pumps, just gravity. And he wasn't done yet. That Thursday, Jackson brought in 2 cubic yards of decorative stone, sandstone red. It clashed with Karen's preferred earth tones, and it definitely didn't match the HOA's color chart. He knew it would trigger her. That was the point. By sunset, the stones were arranged in a spiral that followed the natural curve of his new trench line. Karen was already outside with her phone, snapping photos from across the fence. She didn't wave. Jackson didn't either. That night, he reviewed the cameras again. This time, it was Karen herself. Wearing a wide-brimmed gardening hat at 1:18 a.m., she crept along the slope, holding what looked like a bottle of something thick and dark. She bent down, unscrewed a cap, and poured it along the edge of the trench. By morning, Jackson's new mulch smelled like burnt vinegar. A neighbor walking past asked if something had died in the garden. Jackson just smiled, walked to his camera, pulled the memory card, and slipped it into his pocket. Later that afternoon, he spotted a strange letter taped to his front door. Another violation, this one for non-native stone shapes and unapproved slope regrading. There were photos from his own backyard, clearly taken through a fence. Jackson didn't say a word. He walked back to the shed, opened the logbook, and checked off 2 items from his list. Later that evening, he paid a visit to Marisol, the quiet neighbor next door. She opened the door with a raised brow. "Thought you might want to see this," Jackson said, holding out the flash drive. She didn't even ask what was on it, just stepped aside, letting him in. As the video played, Marisol leaned back in her chair. "She's escalating," she muttered. "She always does when she thinks she's got someone pinned." Jackson nodded slowly. "I think it's time I escalated back." The narrator cuts in as the screen lingers on Jackson reviewing trench diagrams by lamplight. Marisol Alvarez had lived on Echo Ridge Drive for 16 years. Most neighbors thought she was just another retired school teacher with a passion for hummingbird feeders and crossword puzzles. What they didn't know was that before she taught kids the alphabet, she spent a decade untangling environmental case law for a firm that sued corporate land developers and won. Karen Dilly had no idea who she was messing with. After reviewing Jackson's footage, both of Doug's secret piping work and Karen's midnight chemical dump, Marisol sat back with a faint grin, sipping her tea. "She's been crossing lines for years," she said, "but no one ever documented it, not like this." Jackson kept his arms crossed. "She's not just redirecting water, she's weaponizing it." Marisol nodded. "You're not wrong, but to stop her, we'll need to get the city's attention and freeze her control over the board." That night, the 2 of them laid out a timeline. Jackson brought the flood patterns, slope measurements, camera footage, and a detailed layout of water movement through the subdivision. Marisol pulled out folders, real ones color-coded with past HOA meeting transcripts, complaints that mysteriously disappeared, and notes from neighbors who'd quietly been run off. Jackson couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. "You've been holding on to all this?" "I didn't have the right case," she said. "Now I do." The next morning, Jackson started reinforcing his plan, literally. He spent hours installing what looked like garden decorations, but were actually gravity-triggered check valves disguised as sculpted rain basins. His shed became a map room. He marked off flow zones, red flags, and pressure spots on a hand-drawn layout of the neighborhood's slope. Karen, meanwhile, stepped up her game. She had Doug walking the sidewalks in a reflective vest, holding a clipboard, acting like he was there for inspections. People started whispering again. The fear was subtle, but it was there. It rained again on Thursday. Not much, just enough to dampen the stone paths and soak the topsoil. Enough for Jackson to test his setup. He watched from inside, sipping coffee, as water flowed gently through the trench line, swirled into the disguised basins, and vanished into the deep soil piping. Not a drop made it to his patio, but Karen's corner. That was another story. Her runoff line wasn't draining like it used to. Jackson had added a gradient, contoured just enough to push water back the way it came, if the volume spiked too quickly, and spike it did. Friday afternoon, Karen stood outside, glaring at her own puddling mulch. She tapped her phone, made a call, then stormed down the sidewalk to Jackson's house. She didn't knock, just yelled, "You've altered the water path." "I can report that." Jackson opened the door slowly, calmly. "You already have," he said, holding up her last violation notice. "This won't end well for you," she snapped. "It won't end the way you think," he replied, and gently closed the door. Inside, Jackson opened the top drawer of his filing cabinet. Inside were copies of the neighborhood's drainage easement blueprints, public records Karen had never bothered to read. The slope between their properties wasn't owned by the HOA. It was mutual utility space, which meant Jackson's improvements were legal, so long as they didn't obstruct public flow. That evening, he met Marisol again, this time at the local diner, away from prying eyes. She passed him a flash drive that has everything from last year's HOA vote, the one where Karen forced through new landscaping rules. Look closely. The vote count doesn't match the attendance. Jackson pocketed the drive. Rigged elections to Marisol shrugged. She's thorough. They leaned in over the table, lowering their voices. Jackson outlined what would happen if Karen tried another flood tactic during the next major storm. Marisol smirked. You're setting a trap. Jackson looked her in the eye. I'm setting a test. As the camera pulls back, the narrator speaks in a slow drawl. Saturday morning arrived with an odd silence. Not the peaceful kind. The type that lingered before something went sideways. Jackson Riggs felt it the moment he stepped outside and saw the envelope stuck under his windshield wiper. He peeled it off, unfolded it, and scanned the top. Official HOA violation, emergency drainage violation pending city review. Underneath was a stack of documents, charts, photos, and a 2-page report stamped with a logo from a firm called Weather Safe Surveying. According to the report, Jackson had altered natural water flow and created man-made barriers that disrupted the community's hydrological equilibrium. It sounded official. Overly so. He knew this game. Karen didn't knock this time. She just stood in her yard with her arms crossed, watching him read it. Her mouth curled into the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. It's going to be a shame, she called across the yard, when they make you tear up all that pretty gravel. Jackson didn't reply. Just raised the paper in acknowledgement and walked back inside. By noon, a white city truck rolled up. 2 inspectors stepped out. Clipboards in hand, city-issued polo shirts tucked into their belts. Karen was already waiting, holding a binder like it was evidenced in a courtroom. Right this way, she said, pointing toward Jackson's side yard. The runoff you're about to see is threatening our entire street. It's a serious liability. The older of the 2 inspectors, a guy with sun-weathered skin and wraparound sunglasses, looked up at Jackson's roofline, then toward the ground slope. His partner started snapping photos. Karen launched into her pitch, talking about recent pooling, multiple neighbor complaints, and Jackson's unauthorized trenching. But Jackson waited. He didn't interrupt. When she was finally done, he simply said, "May I?" The older inspector nodded. Jackson walked them through the layout. No flash, no defense. Just facts. He pointed out the slope contours, explained the passive drainage channels, showed where water entered and exited. Then he stepped into the shed, came back out, and handed them copies of the original city easement maps. Everything I've done stays within the utility access corridor. And this, he said, holding up a flash drive, includes time-stamped video of my neighbor modifying runoff on her side without permits. Karen's smile cracked for the first time. The inspector took the drive without a word. Karen tried to interrupt. He's manipulating this entire area to retaliate against. We'll review both sides, the inspector said, but we'll be going by code, not committee opinions. She bristled but didn't press start as the city truck pulled away. Karen stormed back to her house and slammed the front door hard enough for birds to scatter from the trees. Jackson remained still, watching the street, then slowly headed back inside. That evening, Marisol dropped by with a small folder tucked under her arm. You might want to see this, she said. Inside the folder was a printout of Weather Safe's website, except the address listed wasn't a business park or a downtown office. It was a residential P.O. box in another state. And the firm's so-called expert, Carter H. Loomis, wasn't registered with any civil board. His LinkedIn profile was 2 weeks old. She created a ghost firm, Marisol said. Filed a fake report. That's fraud. Jackson gave a short laugh, half impressed, half annoyed. She really went all in. Marisol tapped the folder. I already sent it to the city, quietly. But once this hits public records, she'd be in real trouble. For a moment, Jackson didn't say anything. He was watching the sky. Clouds were rolling in, thick ones. They said we've got a thunderstorm coming. He finally said Marisol, followed his gaze. Should be a good test for your design. Jackson just smiled. Not just the design. The rain didn't wait for nightfall. By late afternoon, the clouds had settled over Echo Ridge Drive like a thick wool blanket. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills. Slow and deliberate. The storm wasn't rushing. It was circling, biding its time. Jackson Riggs stood barefoot on his porch, sipping black coffee and watching the sky like a man who'd done this 100 times before. Because he had. The first drops hit around 4:30. Gentle at first, enough to wet the stone path and beat along the gutters. Jackson moved without a word, slipping on his boots and checking every panel of the drainage system. His check valves clicked into place, subtle and quiet. No one watching would have noticed anything had changed, but things had. Up the hill, Karen Dilly stood under her porch awning with a tight expression. She kept glancing toward Jackson's yard as if expecting to see something erupt. Water surging back, maybe some chaos she could point to. But it was calm. For now, Doug Keener, faithful clipboard man and HOA muscle, stood beside her in a slicker jacket 2 sizes too big. He muttered something about hope. He didn't block the secondary flow line. Karen hushed him. She was recording now. Jackson didn't glance her way. He had no interest in starring in one of Karen's dramatized phone videos. He was watching the mulch beds, the basins, the corners where water always tried to outsmart design. By 5 o'clock, the rain grew heavier. Gutters around the neighborhood began overflowing. Kids' bikes were pulled inside. Porch lights flicked on. The street dipped into a muted hum, that soft white noise of water collecting, pooling, whispering secrets to the soil. And still, Jackson's yard stayed dry. It didn't look like a fortress. That was the beauty of it. Every part of it looked natural, as if the land had always wanted to flow this way. The water disappeared into channels, slipped beneath gravel beds, vanished into a soil trench that carried it far from the foundation. Then, it happened. Karen's yard gave way. It started with a sudden shift near her hedge line, a soft buckle in the mulch. Then a slow slithering rise of water near the foundation. She ran into the yard, trying to wave Doug toward the corner. "Get the hose, divert it," she shouted. Doug stumbled across the lawn, slipped, and went down hard. His clipboard snapped in two. The sound it made wasn't loud, but the splash that followed was a steady stream of brown water pushed up from the soil near Karen's side gate. The runoff pipe she'd used to redirect drainage into Jackson's yard was now backfeeding. Water Jackson had caught and gently rerouted uphill, using pressure and slope timing. Her own system was now betraying her. Jackson had never needed to sabotage her property. He simply stopped absorbing what wasn't his problem to begin with. By 5:15, Karen's backyard had turned into a shallow wading pool. Her garden lights flickered and blinked out. A metal lawn flamingo tipped over with a sad splash. And that's when the real trouble began. The basement alarm in Karen's house started blaring. From across the fence, Jackson heard the unmistakable shriek of a sump pump failing. He didn't smile. He didn't move. He just sipped his coffee, walked back to the shed, and clicked off the basin valve for the night. His job was done. Karen, soaked and screaming into her phone, dialed every number she knew. First the HOA emergency line, then the city, then her plumber. Nobody could stop a backflow once gravity took hold, and this time, gravity wasn't on her side. A soft knock came at Jackson's front door. It was Marisol, holding a folded piece of paper. "I got the meeting minutes from last year's vote," she said. "It's worse than we thought. Several votes were signed by residents who'd already moved out." Jackson nodded. "We're getting close." Sunday morning came with clear skies and a heavy silence on Echo Ridge Drive. The storm had passed, but the aftermath lingered like a bruise. Karen Dilly's front yard smelled faintly of mildew, and soggy mulch still clung to her driveway like guilt that wouldn't wash away. The sump pump hadn't survived the night. Neither had her basement carpet. Across the street, neighbors walked, their dogs slower than usual, casting quick glances toward her house and then toward Jackson Riggs, who stood in his driveway coiling a garden hose like it was just another calm day. Doug Keener wasn't around. After slipping and falling during Karen's rain fiasco, he'd limped home with a bruised hip and a bruised ego. The clipboard was still in two pieces. Drying on a trash bin by the curb. Marisol arrived just before noon with a flash drive and a plan. They sat at Jackson's kitchen table, coffee brewing in the background, windows open to the breeze. "Everything we need is here," she said, sliding the drive across the table. Meeting minutes, fake votes, falsified expense reports, and proof of Kyron using HOA funds to pay that bogus storm consultant. Jackson scrolled through the folders. Each one told a story, a slow, steady abuse of power. $1,200 for landscape research that never happened. $800 for an emergency pipe inspection with no receipts. HOA money used to buy security cameras for her house, hidden under the line item community monitoring system. "She didn't even try to cover her tracks," he said. "She didn't think anyone would check," Marisol replied. The neighborhood was changing. Quietly, Jackson had received 5 texts that morning from other homeowners, people who hadn't spoken up before, now asking if it was true Karen's backyard flooded, and if she really tried to find him for fixing his own drainage. Word traveled fast, and so did curiosity. Marisol had one more folder, an email chain from Karen to the rest of the HOA board, instructing them to deny permit requests from Jackson and another resident until he complies with landscape tone guidelines. Jackson leaned back. "That's a coordinated violation of property rights." "Exactly, which means she's not just bossy, she's a liability." Later that day, Marisol walked door to door with a clipboard of her own, not to find anyone, to gather signatures. A petition to call an emergency HOA meeting, one that would force a review of Karen's conduct, and, if approved, remove her. As president, she needed 15 homes. By sunset, she had 20-1. Karen saw her canvassing from the porch and stormed across the lawn. She tried to argue, demanded that neighbors stop engaging in unauthorized gatherings. But no one stopped. Instead, one neighbor pulled out a phone and started recording. Another simply closed their garage door in her face. It was unraveling. That evening, Jackson received a letter from the HOA. Not a violation, a notice. Karen had filed a formal complaint accusing him of sabotaging community drainage systems and spreading false information that undermines HOA governance. He read it twice, then slipped it into a folder marked exhibits. The emergency HOA meeting was set for Thursday at the community hall, and people were already whispering. One couple down the block asked Jackson if he was really the guy who made her basement flood. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no. He just nodded politely and went back to pruning his restored agave bed. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't taking chances. She began handing out typed flyers, labeled "The Truth About Jackson Riggs," accusing him of engineering water traps and infiltrating the HOA to collapse it from within. The neighbors weren't buying it. Some posted the flyers on social media and added laughing emojis. Someone even taped one to a lamppost with "rejected" written across it in red marker. Inside his house, Jackson reviewed the final folder had sent. Buried within the expense reports was a name he hadn't noticed before. Jason Dilley, listed as a site consultant, Karen's son. She had funneled HOA money to her own family. The Ravenwood Hills Community Hall had never seen this many lawn chairs in one room. Rows of neighbors filled the space, whispering, shifting, glancing toward the front table where Karen Dilley sat stiffly between two board members. She wore a navy blue blazer, lips pinched, chin lifted like she was still in control of something, but control was slipping, and the room felt it. Marisol sat 3 rows back, clipboard in her lap. Jackson stood by the rear wall, arms folded, face unreadable. He wasn't here for show. He was here for truth. The emergency HOA meeting began just after 6 p.m. Karen cleared her throat and started with her version. There have been baseless rumors spread about me. False claims of mismanagement, flooding, and so-called fraud. She forced a smile. I'd like to remind everyone that this community depends on structure, order, and firm leadership. A few neighbors nodded out of habit. Most stayed silent. Karen continued, Mr. Riggs has been conducting unauthorized landscaping changes, manipulating drainage, and encouraging unrest. He's undermining this HOA. That was her big swing. Then came Marisol. She stood slowly, calm, and walked to the front. I have evidence to present, she said. Records, contracts, emails, and city permits. All of which contradict what was just said. Karen opened her mouth to object, but one of the board members, Dale, a normally quiet retiree, leaned into the mic. Let's hear her. For the next 20 minutes, Marisol laid it all out. One document at a time. HOA funds routed to Karen's son under false names. The fake surveying company. The altered vote counts from last year. And the kicker, a printout showing Karen had issued more than 30 violation notices to just 4 homes. All of which had refused her committee invitations. Someone gasped. A few heads turned sharply toward Karen. Karen fumbled for her folder. These are fabricated. This is some kind of coordinated. Jackson stepped forward, holding up a small USB drive. I have video evidence of Doug Keener, a board member, diverting water into my yard using hidden piping. I also have footage of Karen applying chemical runoff near my drainage system. He passed the drive to Dale. Karen stood up. You can't just parade around with edited footage, but Dale had already plugged it into a laptop connected to the projector. The room fell silent as the screen lit up. There was Doug, crouched near the hedges, connecting PVC piping under moonlight. Then Karen, in her wide-brimmed hat, pouring from a jug into the trench, clear to Miss Full View. It was more than enough. A murmur swelled. Someone in the third row whispered, she really did it. Another stood and said aloud, this isn't leadership, this is targeting. Karen tried to defend herself. This is being twisted, taken out of context. These are political attacks by people who don't respect structure. Dale leaned into the mic again. His voice was quiet, but it cut the room clean. We've seen enough. A vote was called. It didn't take long. Karen, SC, removal, S. President passed, not barely. Overwhelmingly. She stood there for a long moment, blinking like the room was spinning, but she hadn't moved. Then, slowly, she gathered her papers, muttered something under her breath, and left without looking back. No one followed. Jackson didn't cheer. He didn't gloat. He walked outside, took a breath, and looked up at the sky. For once, it looked like peace. Marisol joined him a moment later. She fight it, she said. People like her always do. She can try, Jackson said, but the water flows both ways now. As they walked back to their homes, a few neighbors stepped forward not just to thank them, but to ask what came next. Now we rebuild, Marisol told one. Not the fences, the trust. 2 weeks passed since the vote. The signs of change weren't loud. They were slow, steady, and everywhere. The Ravenwood Hills Community Bulletin, board once filled with violation notices, was now stocked with flyers for block parties, lawn care referrals, and an upcoming Saturday brunch. The HOA had a new president, Dale, the same quiet man who had once looked the other way, now holding the clipboard for the right reasons. Karen Dilley hadn't been seen much since that meeting. Her yard, once the post for HOA micromanagement, had gone untrimmed. No new flowers, no barking orders from her porch. Just a half-emptied garage and a lawn that looked as tired as she did when she'd last been spotted, loading plastic tubs into the back of a dusty crossover. Jackson Riggs didn't celebrate her silence. He got back to his garden. His agave plants had bounced back stronger than before, standing sharp and stubborn, just like him. The sandstone spiral in his yard had become a quiet attraction for neighbors. A couple even asked if he could help them design something similar. He didn't charge them, just passed along tips and offered to lend tools. One morning, a letter arrived, not from the HOA, not from Karen. This one bore the city seal. Inside was a formal notice stating that the drainage alterations conducted by a resident known to this office through public footage and inspection reports had violated municipal water redirection codes. The letter was addressed to Karen Dilly, a fine of $4,800. Attached was a copy of a report filed by a city inspector, the same one who'd visited during the storm. His notes were concise: unpermitted modifications, false reporting, manipulation of residential runoff, all tied to her. Jackson folded the letter, tucked it into a folder labeled resolved, and didn't give it another thought. But fate wasn't quite finished. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, as Jackson raked pine needles off his gravel paths, a car pulled up and idled along the curb. Karen stepped out slowly, not in her usual sharp suit, but in a faded cardigan and jeans. She didn't walk over, just stood at the edge of his property, eyes locked on the yard she once tried to drown. "I didn't think you'd win," she said. Jackson didn't look up. He never thought anyone would fight back. She nodded. "Once they've turned on me, the board, the neighborhood." He finally looked at her. They didn't turn. They just stopped pretending. Karen didn't argue. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, walked halfway up his path, and held it out. "I know you probably don't care," she said, "but that flooding my house, I blamed you. I made it personal, and I lost everything I tried to control." Jackson took the envelope and opened it slowly. Inside was a check, not for money, a donation receipt, to a local storm damage relief fund. The name on it read Karen Dilly. He said nothing, just gave her a quiet nod. She turned to leave, but paused. "I'm selling the house." Jackson didn't respond when she drove off. He stood there a moment longer, then walked to the shed and placed the receipt next to his original sketch of the slope, a reminder of how things bend over time, especially when someone thinks they can hold back nature with fake paperwork and plastic pipes. Saturday morning came, and the new HOA held its first open yard meet. Lawn chairs lined driveways. Kids rode scooters down the middle of the street. Marisol made lemonade that disappeared. In under an hour, Jackson sat quietly, just off the edge of it all, watching the neighborhood breathe again. As the camera pans across the street, from the flooded memories of the past to the sunlight reflecting off dry, restored yards, the narrator returns. She tried to bury him in runoff and rules, but Jackson didn't need to shout. He just let the land speak back. And when it did, even Karen couldn't stop what hit her.